Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's July 30th, and welcome to the 100th episode of RealTalk MS. In this episode, we're going to look back on some of our most important moments and some of your favorite interviews on the podcast. And we're going to talk with my special guest, Jody Michelle Cooley. First, let me thank all of you who submitted the story of your MS journey to our contest to find my interview guest for this episode. If you're a longtime listener, then you've heard me say before that I consider the podcast to be a two-way conversation between us. So I couldn't really think of a better way to celebrate our 100th episode than by interviewing a member of the RealTalk MS listener community. And actually, I received so many truly remarkable stories that I'll be reaching out to several of you to share your stories on future episodes of RealTalk MS. But before we get to my conversation with Jody, I want to go back to the very first episode of RealTalk MS. In that episode, I told you what you could expect to hear each week on the podcast. So here's what I said 100 episodes ago. Well, we're going to be talking about what I guess you can call current events in the MS community. We'll discuss emerging treatments and potential treatments for multiple sclerosis right as they're being published in the scientific and medical journals. We'll look at new clinical trials when they're recruiting people, and we'll talk about clinical trial results when they're announced. And we'll look at some of the really important issues that are going to affect everyone dealing with MS, like changes in healthcare legislation that might impact your MS treatment, or maybe getting greater transparency in prescription drug pricing. In other words, each week, we're going to be looking at news that you need to know about. You'll even get to hear from some of the people who are making that news. I'll be talking to some of the leading MS research scientists whose work is really adding to and sometimes even changing up what we know about multiple sclerosis. You'll hear from MS activists who are out there making sure that the issues that are most important to you are on the minds of our lawmakers, and you're going to hear directly from some of those lawmakers and elected officials as they give you their own personal perspective on how pending legislation or new laws might actually end up impacting your MS treatment. And you're going to meet some amazing people. You know, these are the MS warriors who are out there every day innovating, creatively, inventing ways to really live their best lives with MS. We'll even be talking about living your best life as an MS caregiver. You know, it's been my experience that MS just doesn't affect individuals. It affects whole families. It changes things for everybody. And as a former caregiver, I really believe that your friend or your family member who's been diagnosed with MS is going to do a better job coping with their disease when their caregiver is doing a good job of balancing their own lives. And trust me, that is far easier said than done. But we're going to talk about how to do it. So that was my game plan 100 episodes ago, and it's still the game plan today. Hopefully you'll continue to hold me accountable to the same promise to talk about the news that you need to know about. You know, what you may not know is that I actually moved up the date for launching RealTalk MS. There was going to be a vote in the Senate that could have repealed the Affordable Care Act and left everyone living with a pre-existing medical condition without any protections. Well, I considered that to be an existential threat against the health and well-being of every family living with MS and every other chronic illness. The bill being voted on was opposed by every major patient organization in the country, including the National MS Society. And it was also opposed by every major medical organization, including the AMA. In spite of it all, the vote was going to be incredibly close, and I thought that it was important enough to launch the podcast in time to talk about it. In fact, my very first guest was former Congresswoman Donna Edwards, who had what I thought was a really interesting story. While she was still in Congress, Donna cast her vote to pass the Affordable Care Act into law. And shortly after leaving Congress, Donna was diagnosed with MS. Facing medical costs of nearly $100,000 a year, I think Donna came to appreciate firsthand how vital the Affordable Care Act was to people living with a chronic illness. I became aware of Donna's story when I read a full-page editorial that she had written in the Washington Post. The editorial was all about why Congress just couldn't repeal the Affordable Care Act. During our conversation, here's how Donna described how she became an MS activist.
Well, for several weeks, I went away. I was actually on an RV road trip across the country. And while I was away, I would listen to snippets of the debate and argument about health care on Capitol Hill. And I heard some comments of some of my former colleagues who were really disparaging toward people who had pre-existing conditions. They were saying things like, well, it was their fault, or they led unhealthy lives, and so we shouldn't be, making sure that we take care of these folks. And I kept hearing things like that, and it made me a little mad. And so I decided that I wanted to weigh in on this debate, and it was at a time when the debate was really raging, and there was a very close opportunity that the Affordable Care Act would be repealed, particularly that provision dealing with pre-existing conditions. And I decided that I needed to use my voice to speak up on behalf of millions of people across the country.
I know some people wonder why I decided to launch RealTalk MS. Well, the idea for the podcast came about because of my participation as a member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. I'm one of 3 lay members on the committee, and our role is to represent the perspectives of families affected by progressive MS. During our meetings, I'd hear about the amazing work that was being done in laboratories around the world, and I had the opportunity to see the level of commitment and dedication and even passion that these scientists brought to that work. And I found myself feeling hopeful about the future. But I wanted to find a way for others who were affected by MS to hear what I was hearing and to feel what I was feeling. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to expand this idea to include news that was important to people living with relapsing remitting MS. I thought that a podcast would be a great way to communicate all of this information, and it would also be an excellent platform to promote MS advocacy, which was also a passionate interest of mine. But true to the origin of the idea, RealTalk MS Episode 4 introduced listeners to the International Progressive MS Alliance. Here's Tim Cutsey, the Chief Advocacy Services and Research Officer for the National MS Society, describing why the idea behind the International Progressive MS Alliance is so important. I thought we could kind of zero in on the subject of progressive MS, and maybe a good place to start is with the International Progressive MS Alliance, which is something that I'm sure some people listening to the podcast aren't fully acquainted with yet. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the Alliance is and how it works and what it does.
Sure. So the Progressive MS Alliance is really one of the most exciting things I've been involved with as a staff member at the National MS Society. What it is it's an international effort which brings together 17 MS societies who are located in 15 different countries, along with 7 different drug companies that are involved in developing treatments for MS, as well as an important group of foundations that are also supporting us. And what this collective effort really is about is bringing focus and attention to progressive MS, and to really being zeroed in on developing new treatments for people with the progressive forms of the disease. It really started out of basically a cry from our community that said, it's great that we have all these treatments for relapsing remitting MS. It's a sign that there's so much progress in research. It's awesome for those who have relapsing MS to have options, but people with progressive MS feel left out every time a new drug gets approved for relapsing forms of MS, and this is really what spurred us, because to me it was just we heard this cry for help that come on, in a sense, people saying to the MS societies of the world, get together and let's find solutions for this. And we banded our efforts together, and we'll talk a little bit more in the podcast, I'm sure, around what went into making it. But, at the bottom line, it's about the global community coming together to say, we don't get solutions to progressive MS as individual organizations. We find solutions by working together and pooling our resources and finding the way to make progress faster.
So the Alliance is obviously a really clear example, but I think it's really important to point out that the progressive MS research effort is really a global effort. How does that fact impact the nature of the research being done, maybe the velocity in which some of that research can get done? I think it's great, and I know that the progressive MS community, the people who are impacted by progressive MS, are ecstatic over the work that's being done. But the fact that it's a global effort, I think, is remarkable. How does that impact the research?
Well, it impacts it in a couple ways. One is that by having a global focus, it allows us to basically say, we're going to go with where the best ideas are. We're going to find the leaders wherever they are, and we're not going to let geography be the boundary which determines who we work with. And so it's allowed us to be much more sort of flexible and focused on finding solutions. And that's been really a core belief of the National MS Society since our founding in 1945 by Sylvia Lowry, who basically had the attitude that we don't care where the solution to MS is found. We care that a solution to MS is found, and we're going to go wherever that means. And so that's been part of our ethic from the beginning, and that wasn't always shared across other MS societies around the world, and the way researchers worked in other worlds. I mean, there was, and still to this day continues to be a certain amount of geographic kind of mindset. But what the Alliance has basically allowed us to do is to say, what, we just don't have time to let geography separate us. We need to find ways to work together. And the other functional reality is researchers are working across the world collaboratively anyway before the Alliance was developed. It used to be that people were pretty much individualists working within their individual labs, individual universities, individual companies. But the reality is now is that the challenges of what we're taking on scientifically are so large and momentous and require so much, so many brains and thinking power that there's just, solo, you just can't do this as solo actors anymore. It does require a team and people working across geographies, across disciplines is the way science happens today. And, what the Alliance is basically doing is we recognize that and say, and now what we want to do is we want to facilitate that. Let's make that even faster. Let's put resources into it. And so in many respects, it's a natural outgrowth of the evolution of where the scientific community was, and also really the MS organization community coming together and saying, you know what, guys, collectively, we're stronger than we are individually, and let's just figure out how we make this work. It wasn't easy, but we figured out how to make it work.
Aside from talking about news that impacts people affected by MS, I also wanted to use the podcast to feature MS warriors, people who are living with MS, who are finding ways to create greater awareness, raise large amounts of money for research, and extend the inclusiveness of the MS community. In episode 15, I interviewed Victoria Reese, and we talked about why she started the We Are Illmatic campaign, a movement designed to bring together women of color who are living with MS.
So unfortunately, I was diagnosed in September 2012. The journey has been short but long at the same time. Like, I got diagnosed, I really didn't know what multiple sclerosis was when I got diagnosed, and it really took me a long time to learn about it, search it. It took me a long time emotionally to be able to accept that that's what I had, and the things that I would be dealing with or potentially dealing with the diagnosis. During that time that I was trying to learn and ease into the MS community, I started going to MS walks out here in Los Angeles, and I would go with my friends, and I really just didn't see that many people of color. I also, when I would research MS, I wouldn't see images of people of color. And sometimes, even on websites, they'll talk about MS, but then they'll break it down by race. And there wouldn't be much information or much studies on African Americans. So it just really, it bothered me that I knew that it had to be other people out there that were African American that had MS, but I wasn't seeing them. So I went to support groups, I've done things like that, and I just really saw a void there. So I was very transparent on social media about having MS, and when I did that, people started coming out of the woodworks, introducing me to, and I didn't say I've never met another Black person that has MS, but people just want me to meet their cousin who had MS, or their daughter, or their sister. So in that transparency on social media, I started to meet other people that were African American with MS, and they would say the exact same thing as me. You're the first Black girl I've seen with MS, or I've never met another person with MS, a Black person with MS. So I really saw the void. So that kind of led me to starting We Are Illmatic, because I understand that the MS Society and other organizations that support the MS community, they do the best that they can. But I think that it also takes people to meet them halfway. And perhaps people in the Black community don't reach out for resources like that. So I kind of wanted to bridge that gap. And here we are.
In episode 48, I talked with Elizabeth Jamison, an extraordinary artist living with progressive MS. Since being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, Elizabeth has transformed her brain MRI scans into remarkable and provocative images that challenge how we view the brain, disability, and even talk about illness. Elizabeth's work is part of the permanent collections at the National Institutes of Health, the Multiple Sclerosis Center at Yale University, the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, the John Paul II MS Rehabilitation Center in Poland, the Center for Brain Science at Harvard University, the MS Clinic at the University of California, San Francisco, and many, many more venues throughout the world. Critics have said that Elizabeth's work stands at the intersection of art and science, and during our conversation, here's how Elizabeth explained how she got started in her work and why her art was so important to her.
Well, I would like to go back to why I'm doing art in the first place. I was a lawyer, courtroom lawyer, and my MS kept progressing to the point where I no longer felt comfortable speaking in the courtroom, and I ended up being an artist sort of by default. And I was trying to figure out something to do with my life, and I somehow bumped into a neighborhood art class. I fell in love, absolutely fell in love with art for some reason, and never looked back. And I thought, what should be the meaning of my life? Because I used to be public interest lawyer representing prisoners and people in inner cities. And I thought, what can I do for MS with my MS? And I looked around my office, found a stack brain scans, and I thought, oh, these are ugly. I don't want to look at them. They were really tattooed permanently on my forehead. So the best way I could talk about my MRIs, because to me that was the symbol of my MS. And I really thought they were disturbing and ugly images. And I didn't want to see myself as ugly and disturbing. So I said, why don't I go into my art practice and transform the images? So it was a project that was very personal to me, is how to make myself feel beautiful and interesting. And that's how it all began, to the practice I'm now into, which is much wider scoped. And so I really find I just love entering in the neurotechnology lab and talking to neurologists and neuroscientists to see what else I could do to make neuroscience and the images that they come up with and make them to reflect the humanity behind the images.
RealTalk MS has provided me with the opportunity to be at the major MS research conferences around the world. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed is producing daily bonus episodes of the podcast directly from these conferences. I've produced special bonus episodes of RealTalk MS from the American Academy of Neurology annual meeting, the Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting, the America's Committee for Treatment and Research in MS annual forum, and the European Committee for Treatment and Research in MS, which hosts the largest MS research conference in the world. Last year, that conference, called ECTRIMS, was held in Berlin, Germany. And on the second day of ECTRIMS, I got together with Bruce Bebo, the Executive Vice President of Research for the National MS Society, and we talked about the things that he was seeing and hearing at the conference. Well, I'm sitting comfortably on a set of steps right outside the City Cube Conference Center in Berlin, talking with the Executive Vice President of Research for the National MS Society, Bruce Bebo. Needless to say, he's quite involved in a lot of what's being discussed at ECTRIMS this year. So, Bruce, what have you seen and heard that's particularly stood out to you?
Well, it's nice to be sitting on the steps with you, John, and to be outside in the fresh air, which doesn't happen very often at this meeting. ECTRIMS is the largest meeting that's focused completely on MS, and there are about 10,000 MS researchers here for these 3 days in Berlin at the City Cube here in Berlin that are all reporting the latest findings from their laboratories and their clinics of what they've been studying in MS. And so it varies across the board from some very basic research about the fundamental pathways that lead to damage that causes MS to information about the latest treatments and how one goes about treating MS and how one goes about helping people with MS live their best lives through wellness and lifestyle and rehabilitation and exercise. So it really runs a whole spectrum from very basic science down to cells and molecules up to populations of people living with MS and trying to learn from populations. I just came out of a session that was doing more of that population research. So what can we learn from looking at large numbers of MS, people living with MS, about triggers for disease and how MS progresses and how we might learn from studying large groups of people living with MS about ways we could slow down or stop progression. So a couple interesting presentations I just saw. One, maybe your listeners remember this excitement about salt a few years ago and some studies and models of MS that showed that salt could enhance immune responses that damaged myelin and led to demyelination and disability in animals. And so people since that made that really interesting observation been trying to find what the connection is in people living with MS. And it was a very interesting presentation. Salt and sodium is really hard to measure in humans. It fluctuates during the course of the day, and it's hard to get a good measurement on it. This investigator used a scanner on your skin that could measure essentially the color of your skin that varies depending on salt concentration, and could get a good measurement of salt, and subsequently was able to correlate some aspects of disease of MS with salt concentration, sort of reviving this salt story a little bit that hadn't really had a lot of follow-ups in some of the animal studies. So I thought that was interesting. Another study I just saw from Johns Hopkins looking at the connection between obesity and brain volume. So we think that the volume of the gray matter in the central nervous system is a good measurement of disability progression. And we also know that obesity is a risk factor for developing MS, and learning more that obesity and it could be also a risk factor for accelerating progression. And so this investigator showed really compelling data that the higher your BMI, your body mass index, the faster your gray matter or the cells in your nervous system were deteriorating. And so it just sort of emphasizes, I think, the growing awareness that being healthy, including having a healthy weight and eating a healthy diet and having healthy habits, can have great effects on reducing the sort of pathway to progression, reducing the rate at which disability progresses. And likewise, being unhealthy, having an unhealthy weight, having unhealthy habits can accelerate progression. So there are many more presentations like that where we're learning more and more about what people with MS can do now to slow down, or perhaps I said the word earlier today, imperceptibly progress, really slow down the rate to the point where you might have trouble noticing it. There's another thing related to the salt story that was really interesting was that some of the immunological markers that showed heightened inflammation in people that had higher salt intake could be reduced by taking a probiotic. And so this link between diet and what we eat, and in this case salt, and the gut microbiome and actual interventions to turn that around is also the topic of conversation here.
This year's ECTRIMS conference is right around the corner. This year it's going to be held in October in Stockholm, Sweden. And I'll be there, so you can look forward to getting a daily bird's-eye view of the important research being presented. You know, when I think about it, I guess of all the benefits of hosting RealTalk MS for the past 100 episodes, the biggest benefit to me has been this remarkable group of people I've been lucky enough to meet and talk with. And the real blessing there is that some of these people have become friends. Two of those people, who I'm proud to call friends, are actually married to each other. Jennifer Digman was diagnosed with progressive MS in 1997, and her husband Dan was diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS in the year 2000. Jennifer and Dan met at a National MS Society event back in 2002, and they were married in 2005. And when they joined me on the podcast, I asked them whether MS was more or less challenging to deal with when both partners had been diagnosed with it. Here's what they had to say. The name of your podcast is A Couple Takes on MS. I'm curious, do you think that MS is more challenging or less challenging to deal with when both partners have been diagnosed with it?
I think, and I don't want to make others out there jealous who don't have a spouse with multiple sclerosis, I think it's a little easier, because if I tell Dan that I'm really tired and my fatigue level is high today, or that my numbness in my right hand is making me crazy, he can shake his head and say, I know what you're talking about, and vice versa. And so that innate understanding of the disease is really, I don't want to say it's a blessing, but it is, to say he understands.
And I think on every given day, obviously, yeah, there is that understanding, but it's just like then what happens on those days are both down. Those are the days when it becomes challenging. And I know it's just like, I can help Jennifer with like transfers and things, but if I get sick, that makes the days a lot more challenging. Just because I can't help. I know that we were in the hotel just last year, and I got sick, and I mean, we were basically could not make the trip that we had planned to do because I couldn't help her make transfers because I was so weak. And so, I mean, on those moments, it's just like what we wouldn't give to have an able-bodied spouse in those elements. But I think that's a
good point.
But for the most part, I think Jennifer gets it. And if I'm tired, I don't even need to explain. It's just like you just say, I'm tired. Whereas I think, we lead a self-help group, and just when we hear stories where others are saying that when they comment that they're tired, if they have an able-bodied spouse who doesn't have MS, maybe they don't fully understand what that means. And so, yeah, I think in that sense we're very fortunate.
One more remarkable person that I have the honor of calling a friend is Jody Michelle Cooley. And although we know each other, Jody submitted the story of her MS journey without any extra lobbying or personal persuading. And after I read her submission, I knew that Jody would be the ideal member of our listener community to talk with on our 100th episode. So in a moment, you'll hear my conversation with Jody Michelle Cooley. My guest today is Jody Michelle Cooley. Jody submitted the story of her MS journey to our 100th episode contest, and as soon as I read it, I knew that she'd be the ideal person for me to be talking to today. Welcome to the podcast, Jody.
Thank you so much, Don. I'm so honored to be the 100th podcast presenter.
I think your story is unique because when it comes to living with MS, you've had to play two different roles in your lifetime. And you took on your first role at the age of 7. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I was about 7 years old, and my mother was having problems walking, losing her balance, and she was having to use me as her human cane. And so I had to witness that and take on responsibilities with helping take care of my sister, who was 2 years old at the time, and taking on responsibilities like cooking and cleaning and things that, a lot more than most 7-year-olds would have to do.
So you were 7 years old, and you're your mom's caregiver. I can't imagine what that must have been like for you. What were you able to take away from that experience?
I had a lot of compassion towards people with disabilities and challenges my whole life, and I felt so terrible, and I used to pray to God every night for God to give back her mobility. I wanted my mom to have that, selfishly for me and for her. And it's one of those things where at the time, my mom didn't get an official diagnosis till I was 9.5, and doctors didn't know anything about the disease. There was no meds, and it was in 1978, and we had no clue. We thought maybe this was as far as it was going to get. So it is tough. I mean, I'm going to find the sense of humor in this. It was great when she was walking with a cane when I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing. You could hear the cane tinking, tink, tink. So she'd go, Jody, and you're like, okay, throw it away, shove it under the bed, do something. So that was the pluses to her having the disease. The bummer was being home and always having to do things for her. Jody, I need you to get this for me. I need you to help me to make dinner. And, I didn't feel like I had a lot of time to be a kid, especially because I had a younger sister. And I also had this kind of like this guilt and shame, for her, for myself. I wanted to protect her from anybody that might make fun of her, and that never happened, but I felt this over responsibility towards the family
And I felt badly for my father as well. I wanted to take some of the burden off of him because she was a lot of work. And as she, got older, I got a lot of responsibility, and I grew up really fast, which was really good. But the minus side is that, my childhood kind of got lost in that as well, because I felt, guilty if I went away too far. I went to college like 2 hours away because I wanted to always make sure I was around in case to help lift the burden on the family.
Let's fast forward in your life. You're 34 years old, and you had just given birth to your daughter. Then what happened?
Gave birth to my daughter, and I was feeling numbness and tingling in my legs, and I thought, oh, this is something, that happens after you get an epidural. And it wasn't going away. And then one day I was standing at my crib with my daughter in my arms, and I collapsed to the ground with her in my arms, which was really scary. My legs just gave way, and it happened another time, and the other time I was not on carpet, it was hardwood floor. And let me tell you, that was not fun. And that, unfortunately, was the end of my high heel wearing, which really bummed me out because I loved wearing high heels.
So you're a new mom and newly diagnosed with MS, and you've lost access to your favorite shoes. Well, that's just a whole lot of stuff to process all at once. How did you manage?
Well, I actually, part of it, when I got the diagnosis, I was like, obviously MS doesn't know me because I'm all positive and I'm all-knowing, and I'm going to cure myself of this. I've already seen this. And, and also was that I was angry. It was like, it was not fair. This was not supposed to be genetic. They say that it's 3 to 5% genetic. I think it's a little higher than that. But I was really angry and frustrated, but I was also really, very proactive. I'm always been a good eater. I was a dancer. I was a massage therapist. I knew all about the body. So, and they also, my mom never had the opportunity to be on the disease-modifying drugs. So I was on the drugs, and I was going to beat this. This MS had met its match.
Full disclosure, I got to know you during the National MS Society's Public Policy Conference. We're both from Southern California, so it's been my very good fortune to spend the Society's day on Capitol Hill with you, where we've met with our senators and congressional representatives to talk about the issues that are important to people affected by MS. What does advocating on behalf of the MS community mean to you? What makes it important enough to fly 3,000 miles, which in itself is a challenge for you, to navigate the halls of the Capitol in your scooter, and fight through MS fatigue, not to mention plain old jet lag, just to make sure the legislators hear you make your case?
It's so important because of the fact that I've seen it. I've had it in my life since I can remember. I was 7 years old, and I'm so honored that I was asked to be a representative. That at the time, when my mom was diagnosed, people were like, MS, what's MS? Is that's Jerry's disease? I'm like, no, it has nothing to do with Jerry's disease. And it's about educating people about this disease that affects no two people any different way. And 80% of the people, have relapsing remitting, and they have what's called the invisible disease. You can't see anything that's going on. And then there's people like me who have the physical, part of it. And it's so important to educate because most people on MS have to apply for Social Security because they have the, and disability, because even though they may not have the physical aspects, they can have, vision problems, they have fatigue problems. There's a whole cocktail. It's a funny thing that when you meet someone with MS, you go, oh, when were you diagnosed? What are your symptoms? What drug are you on? Those are it's like the 3 questions that you always ask. And it's so important to educate people to know that this is not something that we're making up. And we desperately need research and resources, and we get closer and closer every year. And as I said, my mom was diagnosed, there was no drugs on the market, and today there is 14 drugs on the market. I mean, that's so exciting. I mean, we get closer and closer, and with the help of our government, we are able to get funding to things that matter to those of us that live with the disease. And that's so important because it's not just for me, it's for all of us.
What's the lesson been so far for living with MS? What's been your most valuable takeaway?
I do have so many is that allowing yourself the dignity to be angry and sad and cry, because it's not fair. No disease, no condition is ever fair, but to push it down, it doesn't help. And to find yourself a community, whether it be a therapist that deals with this. I'm so fortunate that I have a wonderful husband that helps me. I have so many takeaways. I look at the good rather than the bad, because things that I was not in control of, that I don't have my mobility, but gosh darn it, I was able to travel, and I got to be on stage and do all sorts of things that I can't do right now in the capacity that I used to. But I'm always blown away by the kindness of strangers. When people see me kind of struggling, and I've had people stop their cars in the middle of traffic and come and say, "Can I help you?" And I'm always blown away. I'm so touched that there's so many people who want to help and be of service, and that it can seem like a death sentence, so to speak, but it's not if you have an attitude of gratitude, but also allow yourself to have those moments to scream and cry and say it's not fair.
Jody, it's highly likely that someone who's recently been diagnosed with MS is going to listen to this conversation. What would you want them to know?
I would say exercise, exercise, exercise. Not only your body, but your mind and your soul. And you don't need to share with everyone you meet about your health. But I would definitely seek out professional help to help you process this. Because it's not an easy, you don't know what way you're going to go. But in order to keep the best part of keeping strong is to keep your mind and your body healthy.
Jody Michelle Cooley, you are an inspiration. You've had not one, but two different chapters in your life that could have just burned you out. But your resilience is extraordinary. Thank you for joining me on this special episode of the podcast, and thank you for sharing your story today.
I am most honored. Thank you so much for your service that you're doing to the community, John.
That's going to wrap up this 100th episode of Real Talk MS. 100 episodes ago, I wasn't sure how many people would find value in the podcast. And that's one question that you've answered for me. Today, every episode of Real Talk MS is downloaded thousands of times by people living in more than 60 countries around the world. I absolutely love getting your emails, direct messages, and phone calls with your suggestions for future topics that you'd like to hear about. So let's keep this conversation going. Here's to our next 100 episodes. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. And we'll catch you next time.